Unreal Movie Studio because I got a request from somebody to make a tutorial. So basically what we're going to be doing now is opening the UMS package first, and that is simply done by going to your actor class and selecting UMS. Before anything, I'd just like to point out that this tutorial isn't for beginners of Unreal Editor. I expect you to know the basics of Unreal Editor before you delve into Unreal Movie Studio. So first of all, I'm just going to make a box, and in this box I'm going to add a movie camera, and the movie camera is basically the entirety of the visual aspect of Unreal Movie Studio. This is the thing that you're going to use to have the player look at something. And the first thing I would like to point out about this movie camera is two things. First of all, the important part is the tag, because this is what you're going to refer to in the director properties when you're talking about this camera. So I'm just going to name it TestCam1. Now this is the field of view. For realistic cameras it only goes up to 52, but of course you can put it up to 90 or whatnot. I'm going to put it up to 52. Now that we got that done, set your movie camera to wherever you'd like it to be. Right now I'm just going to put a light here and build geometry just to sort of show things. The second thing you need to do is go to UMS and add a director. This is the thing that basically handles the entirety of the movie, if you will. A few things that I'd like to point about the director is, first of all, the B-rolling boolean. If you set this to true, when you start the game it will be rolling, literally. It will initialize without any instigation. Secondly, of course, if you would like to activate it by a trigger, then you need to name it. But I'm going to set it to be rolling. Like I said, if you want it to be activated by a trigger, make sure you set the tag. Now this is the script. All these properties are basically forms for commands. In essence, this is where you're going to be telling the director what you want to happen. The first command I'm going to put in is a command for the movie camera, and what this does is it just simply sets the camera to cut to. So we named it TestCam1. So in here I'm going to put camera TestCam1 cut to, and this is simply the command for the camera to be moved, or for the player's view to be moved to the camera. I'm going to set this down here because I'd like to point out a few things about UMS. First thing I'd like to point out is that if you're doing a movie and it's not a campaign, or it's not any sort of map, it's just the entire map is simply intended for the movie, then I recommend you do a few things to set up that movie in the first director. The first thing would be set speed, and what this does is simply it sets the actual game speed. And here we have our script values. These are used from anything from fade times to simple values as set speed, and we're going to set it to 1, which is the standard speed. Secondly, I'd like to point out the change HUD command, which is simply change HUD, and I'm going to set the HUD to UMS movie HUD, which is simply a blank HUD. There's nothing on it. And again, you can pretty much set this to anything. The thing about execution commands is, while they are not case sensitive or anything of that strict nature, they are sensitive as to what exactly you put. So for instance, if you put fade, it won't understand what to do, or if you put spawn, say, Unreal Mercenary, well, it's not going to know what to do unless you add the entire all the parameters, in other words. So that would be, for instance, mercenary and none being the second parameter. If you do not add the second parameter, in some cases it will not execute the command properly. So just be mindful of what exactly you do. For example, there are some commands where there's a difference between move to and move to with a space in the middle. So now that we've got that out of the way, we could just do a simple test. And this is simply going to set the speed, change the HUD, and change the view to the test camera. I'm going to go ahead and change the game type so that there's no bots spawning. I'm just going to set it to the Unreal Single Player 2 Old School game type. And this is just a test. Of course, we need a player start. To point out about this is that you generally want, especially in just movie levels, you would want to put the player start in a separate room that is completely dark, so that if it pre-catches, it will not, you know, show something that may make your movie awkward. One other thing that you can do instead of setting the game type to that is set it to the UMS movie game type, and that will prevent any HUD. It just has a blank HUD, which is more convenient if you're trying to make it look professional in a sense. So now that I've given you some of the basics and the basic setup for Unreal Movie Studio, I'd like to give you some commands for the camera. The first being pan. If you notice, we already have our basic setup. Now there's two methods you can use for pan, and right here I'd like to point out you sort of notice the syntax of the commands, where it points to an object, then there's the execution command, and there's parameters afterward. So in this command we have pan, which is rotation of the camera. And again, there's two methods. The first is if you simply put pan here, and then in the script rotators, in the corresponding number, you would put whatever, say 1024, 65, 536, a full revolution. Then you would put in the corresponding number, in script values, the time it takes to pan to a certain object. So if I wanted it to take 5 seconds to pan towards something, I would put 5 here in the corresponding number. The second method to panning an object, among many other sorts of things, is pan to. And what this does, as opposed to simply inputting numbers into the script rotators, is you pan to a point. So it's going to be camera pan, and mind you, you have to put the actual tag of the camera. So camera test cam 1 pan 2, and we're going to pan it to a point. Well, we don't have this point yet, but it always looks for a tag. It does not look for a name, as in an object name or an actor name. It looks for a tag. So if we go to key point, there's an actor that does nothing. Simply, it is just for the use of being there, for the use of cameras. So let's rename this simple point 1. This is what the camera will be looking for or looking at when it pans. So if we go back to our director, we can see make sure that your syntax is correct and there are no spelling errors or anything. So now you can see this is going to pan towards that in a matter of 5 seconds. Now here I'd like to also show you this wait times, and what this basically does is the same thing as a trigger dispatcher. It simply delays for the amount of time given. So for instance, if I wanted to delay the pan, I would in the previous slot put the amount of time I want. So if I wanted to wait 2 seconds before it actually pans, it will execute the command number 2, and then it will execute number 3 after 2 seconds. Make note that as opposed to the dispatcher, this goes here and it executes the command before, or rather after it goes to that number. So as opposed to the dispatcher, which goes to a certain slot and waits, it executes then waits. Just keep that in mind. So again, we're panning to that, and if you want to look at an example here. The next thing we're going to do is the command dolly, which is simply to move the camera. I'm simply going to replace this pan command with dolly, and this will essentially do the same thing. And again, the time it takes for the camera to get to the point specified will be in script values. Now again, there are 2 methods to using dolly. The first is simply to put dolly without the to a certain actor, and then you would have to specify in the corresponding number the location that it should go to. Of course, often simply specifying a point is often more convenient. Another useful command would be simply camera test cam 1 zoom, and what this does is essentially simply zoom the camera. Once more, in script values you would have the amount of time it would take to complete that zoom, and here you would have to specify in the x value of script vectors and the corresponding number the amount you would want it to zoom in to. And I'm just going to add that and do a wait time here. Another useful command, and for this one I'm going to add a new camera with the same properties, and this is going to be test cam 2 for the purpose of separating the 2 cameras so you can see 2 different sort of effects. And I'm going to add another simple point. This time I'm going to make it visible for the simple purpose of showing you what exactly it does. So I'm going to add a simple point and name it simple point 2. Now that we have our camera, I'm going to set this camera to a field of view of 72. Now if we go back to our director, we first want to point out that we're now going to want to switch cameras. So we put camera test cam to cut to, which cuts to this camera, and make sure it's named and everything is proper in terms of syntax and whatnot. Now the command I was talking about is track, and this command simply tracks an object. Unfortunately, right now we are not going to use that command just as of yet, simply because for the purpose of showing you other actors in a few minutes that actually move, because again, a camera tracks an object, but the camera itself doesn't move, the object moves. Now, if, for example, let's say I'm going to put mercenary 1 and add a mercenary 1 to track, and again make sure it has the proper one. What I'm going to do is simply add a mercenary to show you that what exactly it does, what exactly it tracks. And remember to name everything. Make sure the syntax is correct. And also be mindful of your wait times. Be mindful of what you know, the timing on everything, because often, especially in Unreal Movie Studio, things can get quite tedious, and you'd have to do a lot of trial and error to get the perfect timing for everything. So I'm going to put a 2-second delay on that track, and I'm going to test it quickly. Here I've added 2 patrol points simply to show what would happen if you actually track the moving object, simply so we can move on to the next one. Now we're going to move on to the next command, which is circle. And what this does is it simply circles an object, or rather goes around it. And I'm going to change that specific object to simple point 2, which is the point I put previously before adding the mercenary. Now, 2 things I'd like to point about the circle command is, firstly, the time would be specified rather by the revolution. So, for instance, if I wanted the camera to circle in one revolution per second, I would go to my script vectors in the corresponding slot, which is number 6, and I would put 65536 as a full revolution in 1 second. This you often have to play with to sort of gauge what you want. And if, for example, I put it at 8384 or 8192, and again, this is circling this point. And if you notice, there is a problem here, because although the camera is circling the point, it is not actually tracking the point. And the simple fix of that is to specify that you would like this tracked. So you would add camera test cam to track simple point 2 as well, which would give a circling around with the camera always staying on point on that simple point. One more command I would like to show you is simply, and it is rather simple for its very effective use, which is chase cam. So if I put chase cam here, you would have to specify a certain actor which it would chase. So that's the use of chase cam. You simply specify a certain actor. The problem often though is that, for instance, with movers, it does act buggy. With actors, as in the regular actors, player pawns and whatnot, it is not so much a problem. But again, with movers, you would have to, or preferably, to get it to, or ensure that it does work, you would have to add an attach mover and attach the movie camera to the mover and then track it, or use chase cam with that. That's just another command. Now that I've shown you the basic commands for the camera, I'd like to introduce the movie pawn. If you extend pawn, you should see, after you open UMS, a movie pawn. And if you spawn this or set it in the editor, it comes out as an alley. And to simply change that, you would go to your mesh browser and select the mesh, or type it in, either way. So I'm going to select a Scareger Warrior instead, Scar Warrior. And once more, you'd have to name this. Now, for the sake of cutting time, I'm going to add a new director, which you can do. You can have two different directors rolling, but if you get advanced with it, especially if both directors have camera cuts, you'd have to be very meticulous about what's going on, or it will obviously sort of bug out. So this will simply be the director, and remember to set it to true on B rolling for specifying what our movie pawn will do. The first command I would like to point out, and remember the context of the command, this is a pawn, not a camera, so we're putting pawn, and then movie pawn 1. The first command would be play anim. This simply plays an animation. Now, if you'd like to play one animation, then you simply put play anim. If you would like to loop that animation, you'd put play anim space loop. Now, two things I'd like to point out here. First off, to get the actual animation, go to your mesh browser and specify what animation you want in the script names and in the corresponding number. For script values, this is the speed of the animation, the speed at which you want the animation to loop, and that is essentially it for animating something. Now I'm going to actually change this to walking, just for the sake of making it look better, not awkward. Now the second animation command would be to set the pawn to stop the animation. And there are two ways to do this. The first is to stop the animation like this, which finishes the animation and then stops. If you would like to immediately stop the animation, you'd have to specify the parameter hard. Stop anim hard immediately stops the animation. And I'm going to just change this to stop animation. One other thing I would like to point out about the first command is in script vectors in X, this is the tween time between animations. So if you have one animation and then the very next command is another animation, or two animations connected together from one actor. This would be the time it takes from to transition from that animation to the other. That's tween time. So in between these two things, I would like to add another command. This is simply the same thing as dollying with the camera. It's moving something to a point. Move to simple point 1, for example. And this would move it to simple point 1. So I'm just going to turn him towards that. And remember to make sure the syntax and everything is correct, because if not, it might be confused and change the point or something of the sort. So again, with script values, this what happens is this is the time it will take for this pawn to move to that point. That's in script values. Now, for the convenience of making it appear nice, I'm going to set movie pawn 1 to play anim loop right after that, which that animation will be gun check. And remember to specify everything necessary, as in the times and whatnot, and especially make note of the wait times. So if you would like for this to hold on for a moment, be sure to do that. I'm not going to do that until number 2. And for instance, if you have 5 seconds here, you would want to generally also correlate that in the wait times. So I put 5 seconds. And that should make this pawn behave correctly. Before we move on, I'd like to make a correction. Do make note that, again, you have to check everything, make sure that everything is to the point and accurate. So before I did not add movie, I just added movie pawn, not movie pawn 1. Now it should work. With things such as move to, you'd want to specify often in director the corresponding location in script factor. So for instance, if you want the movie pawn to move to a certain place and you use script vectors, you would simply go again to the corresponding number and enter the location of that certain point which you want it to go to. The same thing with panning. If you want the pawn to rotate towards something, instead of saying pan, you would say rotate to, and then, for example, simple point 2. And that would simply have the pawn rotate to the specified tag, specified actor. And it does not necessarily have to be a simple point. So long as the tag is correct and the syntax is correct, it can be any sort of actor, anything from decoration to another pawn or something like that. Now, here I'd like to point out a few other things. If you want a pawn to actually, and this is often only for Unreal Tournament models, if you would want to give the pawn a weapon, for instance. Now before we move on to the next section, there are a few things for weapon holding and Unreal Tournament based models that I'd like to point out. The first would be, and if you notice I did change the movie pawn from a Scar Warrior to a soldier. The first would be to set weapon, or give the pawn a weapon. Now this is not done by setting the weapon in script names. This entire command is simply in the script. And to make sure that you set the actual correct name of the weapon, a good thing to do would simply be to go to the inventory and find the weapon and notice the package and the weapon name here. So for instance, if I wanted to give him let's say a flat cannon, you notice that the package is Unreal 1 and the script name is flat cannon, so you'd have to put that exactly as it is. Of course, this would give the pawn a flat cannon. A few other commands for the pawn, the movie pawn, are circle and track, just like the camera. So if I wanted to have the pawn circle something, I would simply put movie pawn 1 circle, or to track, and specify the parameters of each, in script vectors and script rotators. As we covered, the commands set weapon, which would be to specify the pawn, then set weapon, which we have. Now that we have all this, I'd like to move on to more miscellaneous sorts of commands. If you ever need to look up a command or anything of the sort, you would simply go to the director script, and it has all the commands here. Now the first command I'd like to point out, if you notice I added another director, and this is set to be rolling true as well, is dialogue. And this simply adds dialogue to the level, which is very convenient because you wouldn't have to trigger a special event that has display message, for instance. If you put effect, which is another useful command, this does the same thing as any event trigger would do. So if you wanted to trigger a special event, you would put effect, then the name of the special event. Set volume simply sets volume. You specify this in script value, the actual volume. If you want to play a song, it would be play song, then the name of the song. So for instance, if you wanted to play this song, it would have to be in the same context as a song, the file that you would specify in a music event actor. Loop simply does a loop in the director. That means if you wanted to play the director over 5 times, you would put loop 5, and that's it, or any sort of a number. If you wanted to spawn something, this is another useful command. It's just a little bit buggy in the way you have to do it. For instance, if I wanted to spawn a mercenary, not only would I have to specify the name in the context of the proper actor name in the context of Unreal Editor, but I would also have to add in the parameter. What this does is, this is the base class that's being spawned. This is the appended actor, or any actor that spawns within. In this case, we don't want anything because it can't be appended to a mercenary. So we put none, and this will spawn a mercenary. And again, this can be used for pretty much any actor. You can spawn any actor. And those are the miscellaneous commands. We will be going over a few other, and this is special effects, basically. I don't quite remember if I saved it. Yes, I did. So here I have two special effects. We're just going to go over motion blur, and what this does is simply add a motion blur. It's a rather interesting effect. And if you notice here, I also added a spawn mercenary, so it will spawn a mercenary. Now, to turn motion blur on, it's simply motion blur on, and you would specify, you sort of have to play with this when you specify the value here of sort of the speed. I wouldn't want to say speed, but sort of, play with it for it to meet your needs. Now, I'd like to show you what exactly this does. If you use motion blur with, for instance, a set speed, where you set the speed to a slower speed, you get some interesting effects. There's also fade, which is a rather buggy command, wherein you specify the fade color, the fade out color, and what's more, you have to specify if you want it to fade out or in, just like motion blur on and motion blur off. And you would specify the fade, quote, color, unquote, in script vectors. But once more, that's a buggy command. You might be better off simply using a fade view trigger and just triggering it using effect command. One last thing I would like to point out or show you regarding, the camera is interpolation, and this is rather easily done, so long as you know how to interpolate actors, which is done by adding your interpolation points throughout a map. So, for instance, if I simply went to the original map, let's say city intro, which has interpolation points. Now, if I would actually want to interpolate this and change this up so that instead of the default actors being used, I'd like to use a director, you'd add a camera, and you go to script, and the simple command would be a camera and then the camera name. After you cut to it, you would simply do this, interpolate, where IP path is the tag of the interpolation points and the interpolation path. And this essentially does the same thing that any interpolation path would do, which is to place the camera on the path and move it forward, just as it is done with the normal generic camera actors for Unreal Tournament. The reason I'm not going to show you this is because it's going to take a little bit of time to do, and I'd prefer not to do two different tutorials, one for an interpolation point or interpolation path and the other for Unreal Movie Studio. One other thing I would like to point out before finishing this tutorial is something that is often overlooked in the Unreal Movie Studio package, which is the hacked movie credits or movie credits, either one. And what the problem isn't so much that it's difficult to use; it's simply overlooked. What this does is simply have like a sort of scrolling credits, and it is again very useful. What happens here, if I can get the director, is you have to trigger the hacked movie credits or movie credits using an effect command, as I have here. Now, in the movie credits, you'll find quite a few things. There's a lot of useful things. First of all, credit size is the font size of the credits. The script is actually placed here, and you have over 500 lines of script that you can use. Credits pick is a texture, and this has to be used or set up with respect to whatever else is on the script, so you wouldn't want to overlap it or anything. But this is simply a texture that is shown in the scrolling credits. Credits offset would be if you would like to move the credits from the center of the screen to one side or the other. This is the offset for that. And the gap is simply spacing if you'd like to space each line. These are the separate colors. If you do not use a master color, use the separate colors of the text. And this is alignment. They would align the credits with certain basically invisible line, if you will. This is the scrolling time, and this is the master color, obviously, what they do. And this can be used to your advantage. It's very useful for anything from a campaign to the end of a mod or something, credits of a mod, etc. This is something that you sort of have to play with